Good afternoon. This is Jason Dean coming at you again for a second show. I usually do one show every morning for Film Fanatic, the YouTube channel that I have. Kind of got into this, I don't know, daily practice of doing it probably since August or so of this year. And I usually do, at first, I was doing one video every couple of days. I used to do when I was doing Film Fanatic videos on Facebook, I was doing them like once a month. I was really like trying to spread them out because I felt like, well, I don't want to overstay my welcome, and who wants to see my face more than once a week? But I realized it helped that channel. It helped the page, the Film Fanatic page that I have on Facebook, which is still a thing, and I still put some time into it with posts and whatnot every day, and as well as my Instagram video channel, or my main Film Fanatic on my Instagram page, which is mostly posts. There are some video things. I was doing some Instagram videos for a while, but I realized over time that they were, it was getting more traction, and then I expanded it. Probably about August, I started doing the YouTube thing, and then I started doing it a couple times a week. My schedule changed, and the way I was doing the videos changed a lot. I was, the way I've been shooting the videos and filming them, but then also the time of day, and I plus I had a lot more flexibility with my schedule. And then I noticed that started to help the channel grow with viewers and people liking the channel, and that was also combined with that I've been buying more movies than ever, so that I've been more than I've ever done before in my life. So I just decided to do them every day. So I'm in a regular daily practice, or ritual, if you want to call it, of doing a video a day. I watch a movie. I watch at least one movie a night. Usually, that's usually my jam. And sometimes I watch more, like a few back to back. But generally, I usually always watch a movie a day. And so it's been great. It's been fun. I've noticed that that's been helping the channel and all those good things. So today, this is an impromptu video. I did a video earlier today on It Follows, which is an awesome, I think one of the best horror films that's come out in the last 20 years. And I put that under the label of more modern contemporary horror films that I feel is definitely a stand alone film, but definitely a stand out film, along the lines with some more recent films like Pearl and X and Hereditary, uh, the Black Phone, and whatnot. Because there's been some really great movies. And then, so today I've been hearing a lot that today is John Carpenter's birthday. One of the most iconic directors in all of horror history. So today's his birthday. He turned 74 today, which is wild. I've been reading some reports. He hasn't actually directed a film in quite a few years, but he's been really busy on the front of being a composer. He's been writing music. Well, ever since his career started, he's always been composing for his own films. I mean, the iconic score for Halloween, which everyone knows in the horror world and loves. Just, what more can be said about that film score? And since then, virtually every film he's done, he has composed the music for. Another one, which I think probably might be my personal favorite, is the score he composed for Escape from New York. And I think he is definitely one of the key figures in horror. I think he is definitely, to a degree, gave birth, one of those central characters or key figures that gave birth to what has now become or known as the American slasher film. I look at the lineage of the first directors, writers who really played a pivotal role in shaping everything that we see now in all things horror. And I sometimes think of making a list in regards to that. But I usually keep things loose, because it does change a lot. I do discover new things here and there about kind of as far as dealing with in the world of horror from maybe like a historical context. But I think some of the key figures, just off the top of my head, are that are the most iconic horror heroes, if you will, that were doing things before anyone else, and they also set a precedent, set the bar incredibly high, but then they went on to influence millions of other filmmakers. I think as far as filmmakers that go, you know, one of the guys I would say was was the number one guy and the person that was the director that was generally doing films, horror films, that had, say, copious amounts of gore and violence, where there was the gore and the practical effects, all those things were, kind of introduced to horror, say, for the first time. And I would say, like Herschel Gordon Lewis, the American exploitation horror director, is definitely the godfather of that aspect in horror films, as far as introducing horror films that had copious amounts of gore and to a degree violence in films. To a degree, 50 years, 55, 60 years ago on this date. Herschel Gordon Lewis, I think, is definitely the key figure when it comes to horror films where they showed gore and copious amounts of violence. He was doing it. He predated everyone, even the Italian directors. Hugely influential, and definitely more in the exploitation world. But I feel like as a figure, he left his mark, and he was the most innovative horror director, and ahead of his time in that particular kind of style. And then other directors, I feel, that were also taking on aspects of the slasher film and horror films, taking aspects of horror films to new levels and new heights, were the Italian directors. Shortly after Herschel Gordon Lewis, I would put directors like Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci. So many great Italian directors, so many amazing European horror exploitation directors that were coming out during the, even late 50s to 60s and 70s, that went on to influence millions of other directors. But I feel at the end of the day, it's definitely, probably from at least from what I've gathered and from my knowledge of the genre, I would say Lucio Fulci and Dario Argento were doing these kinds of films, particularly around introducing elements of horror and the giallo style, elements of suspense, complex storylines, the killer with the gloves, all elements that were eventually used in American slasher films and also your other European films. But I feel like Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci were the guys that kind of more or less created that style. Another director I would say during that time period that was also incredibly influential on all things horror, especially in that realm of the exploitation world, would be Jess Franco, the Spanish director. He's probably the most prolific director I have discovered. Again, it was one of those he's one of those guys that I did see lots of his films when I was a kid. During the days of VHS. But later on, as I've gotten older and I've become more of a collector, I've kind of rediscovered the work of Jess Franco. And it wasn't all that long ago when I realized the amount of work that he put out, the body of work, which is unprecedented and unlike any other director that I've come across. Other directors that are outside of the horror genre that I would name that I would almost think are to a degree uh, were are as prolific as Jess Franco would be a director like Akira Kurosawa from Japan, one of my all-time favorite directors. You know, close to 100 films. I think somewhere around 85 to 95 films he directed during the course of his career. Jess Franco surpassed about 100. I believe there's like 100 to 120 to 130 films that he directed over his incredible career. He did other things, other films that were outside of the horror genre, but he's primarily known to be the purveyor uh, of using the classic kind of giallo formula, the slasher element, and copious amounts of gore and practical effects. Just iconic, just iconic. And I feel like John Carpenter is also right up there with all of those four directors that I named. Herschel Gordon Lewis, Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci, Jess Franco, and John Carpenter. Stylistically, all very different in a lot of ways, but you can see all of like those four directors. I feel like were incredibly innovative, incredibly ahead of their time. And just for example, with what John Carpenter did, he basically gave birth to, in a lot of ways, to really shaping and to a degree giving birth to the American slasher film. There were films before him that came out in the 70s that predated Halloween that were slasher films, but they were more influenced by, I would say, the Italians than, say, the Americans. But as far as American figures and key figures in America, there weren't really any directors that had that name, I would say, like John Carpenter. He really gave birth to that. I mean, Sean Cunningham, who directed the first Friday the 13th, and then which led to the entire franchise, has notoriously said in many interviews that he modeled that film and then the following films off of Halloween, and how that gave birth to what became like the American slasher, which that came out in '78. So that was right at the height of the American slasher period. You have the mid to late '70s to the mid '80s, when maybe up until about 80s, 88, 89, 87, around there was kind of the height of the whole American slasher film um, um, explosion. And it's pretty wild to see that there are still films that come out that are very much influenced by that period. There aren't necessarily, I wouldn't say slasher films as a whole are really being made anymore, which it would be cool if that was a thing. Every now and then I come across a newer film or whatnot that is definitely influenced by the that formula of what makes a slasher film, and they've all been influenced by a lot of these directors. But it's very different, or it goes into very different directions. And occasionally there are some low budget horror films that I come across in modern context that are kind of straight up slasher films. One in particular, which I think is a really good one, and it's a super low budget one, but there's a film that came out about 8 years ago or so called Blood Widow. Super underground American, slasher horror exploitation movie that very much sticks to that formula that that these guys created in regards to the horror slasher exploitation world, and it's really a great movie. But John Carpenter, since today's his birthday, I mean, what else can be said about such an iconic director? I mean, definitely one of my all-time favorite directors, and I think without his imprint or his footprint of what he created, horror, that everything related to horror now would be different. I think he definitely was one of those pioneers. He was also one of the first directors that came out of the independent world that took, the idea of what or what a independent film could do commercially and actually have an impact in the commercial world and set and make lots of money, and it could expand the idea of what slasher films could do in the market, not just taking it out of like this small like cult like status, but that it could actually be a viable commercial style that could garner in massive bucks at the box office. I mean, look at what Friday 13th, or I should say, look at what the franchise of Halloween has become, and with the last three films, especially the second to last two Halloween films, how much money they've made in the box office, more than they've ever done. So it's and all of the incarnations and all of the new directors that have worked on those films and various people who have been involved with those films. Unprecedented to see that that franchise is more alive now than ever, and is still such a huge box office beast. In terms of say, through if you're looking at it from like a commercial perspective. So many films. I mean, Halloween, 1978, one of the greatest horror films ever. My personal favorite of John Carpenter's collection of movies, and again, there's so many great ones, but probably my favorite one is 1982's The Thing, starring Kurt Russell. That movie is just pure, unadulterated, gripping suspense from beginning to end. I just can never get enough of that movie. Part of me hates myself because I don't own that on Blu-ray. I have no idea why I don't. There's actually quite a few John Carpenter movies I don't own, which is ridiculous. I grew up watching his films, and I've seen all of his films probably bazillion times. I have some DVD copies of his films. I have a few copies of The Thing and a few copies of Halloween and a few of his other films. But a lot of them I don't. I just need to get it together and upgrade that. Another film of his, which I think is a close second, might even be tied with The Thing, is Escape from New York. That movie is just so incredible. I just recently watched that again, probably last month, and I was just blown away by how timeless that film is, and how it really is this weird mirror or reflection of kind of how we are now as a society. With this very structured kind of dystopian place that we're at, or unstructured. And then again, all of the other spin-offs, or with Halloween becoming this giant franchise, is that's a whole other thing. But as far as films that he directed, The Fog is another one that I love. That's one of my all-time favorite John Carpenter films. I remember as a kid, my first experience with watching John Carpenter was obviously Halloween and then The Fog. Those were the first two movies I remember seeing as a real little kid, and they always scared the crap out of me. And that was like my introduction to his work. He also did another film which I think is pretty underrated. It is a film I'd like to see again. It's been many, many years, but I remember it being pretty good. But for the films of John Carpenter, a film that gets overlooked quite a bit, Vampires, which came out in 1998. Another one that's an iconic classic, They Live, starring Roddy Piper. Just an amazing film. Just a great combination of sci-fi and horror, but just such an incredible movie. Another one that I think is just one of his best films easily is Big Trouble in Little China, which came out in 1986. Amazing movie, another masterpiece. And The Fog, which came out in 1980. I always forget that came out in 1980, and I always forget how old that film is. still terrifying. Still just oozes with atmosphere. That's one of the things I love about John Carpenter's work is all of the atmosphere in his films. He pays so much attention to creating that universe. And that's really due to Dean Cundey, who is my favorite cinematographer of all time, not just in horror films, but in general. And Dean Cundey did all of the cinematography for all of John Carpenter's films, and he's like really responsible for creating that atmosphere in virtually every one of his films. It's pretty unbelievable. He also did another film, which was a later film with Donald Pleasance, who Donald Pleasance starred in Halloween and also Escape from New York. He also did a film with him later in 1987 called Prince of Darkness, which is another one I would really love to see again. I haven't seen that in a very, very long time. He also had an obvious long-standing relationship with Kurt Russell. Kurt Russell working on The Thing, Escape from New York, and then also Escape from L.A., which is another one I'd like to see again because I haven't seen that in many, many years. So he's done, and then also Big Trouble in Little China. So he's done quite like 4 movies. And rumor has it, I just read recently, John Carpenter, like I said, he's mostly been busy doing score. He's basically acted as a film scorer lately. He did the music for that movie that came out last year, the Firestarter remake, which isn't a very good movie, but he did the music for that. He scored all of the newer, the last 3 Halloween films, and he's done a couple other projects since then. So he's been doing that. But I saw a little article saying that he was possibly going to be directing and writing a sequel to Escape from L.A. and with Kurt Russell. So that would be interesting to see what happens. He just turned 76 today. Another one of his films that I love, love, love to death, which I think is one that sometimes gets overlooked, and it's one of the grittiest movies ever, which is Assault on Precinct 13. Just an amazing film. Such a gritty, raw movie. I feel like that, if anything, that film could fall, out of all of his films, that probably has the most kind of gritty exploitation-ish kind of vibe to it. But such an awesome movie. 76. It's hard to believe that was like technically his first movie. And again, Escape from L.A. he did in 96, also with Kurt Russell. Haven't seen that in many years. Ghosts of Mars, which was 2001. That movie was a pretty strange movie. I remember it being okay, but not great, but that would be something to see again. He also directed a movie which is so strange, and I always forget about. He did a version of Elvis, starring Kurt Russell in 1979, which is wild. And again, I haven't seen that in years and years and years. He also did a remake of Village of the Damned in 1995. Another film of his that I recently bought, actually bought last year, was Starman. And it's his, like, probably, well, if you want to call it that, but probably his most, like, family-friendly film. And it's a love story with starring Jeff Bridges. But it's a great movie. I forgot how awesome of a movie it is and how different it is from anything else that he'd ever done. And he's never done anything since then. Another one that I think is another one that is so overrated and overlooked, which is just I think one of the best movies he's ever done, is in the Mouth of Madness, which was based on a H.P. Lovecraft story, I believe, starring Sam Neill. Oh, just such a great movie, such a an amazing horror film. I just love that movie. He also directed Christine, which I think is definitely one of the best film adaptations of a Stephen King book. Christine, I mean, iconic, classic movie. So many great films. His original, like the way Carpenter kind of got into the film industry is he worked for many years out of working with Roger Corman. And Roger Corman is definitely a father to the whole exploitation world. He worked on all of these B movies, super low budget exploitation movies. And John Carpenter's first kind of creative venture with working with Roger Corman was Dark Star, which came out in '74. So it's amazing how long he's been doing this and how prolific he really was. And even though he hasn't directed any films in quite a few years, how he still is very much involved doing his film score stuff. He's also, along with the film score stuff for like the last few years, with the newer kind of Halloween trilogy and Firestarter, and I know he did another movie fairly recently. He's also he went on tour where he was performing a lot of the music that he's composed for a lot of his films, and also other additional music that he's composed. He went on tour and was like a touring musician. And he also has a really long-standing relationship with his son, who I think his name is Cody Carpenter. And a lot of the newer projects he's been doing, from a compositional standpoint in the music world, in the electronic world, is with his son Cody Carpenter, who also like kind of co-writes these more recent projects. They create a lot of these things together. So, without a doubt, John Carpenter is one of the greatest filmmakers ever in general, not just horror. One of my all-time favorite horror directors. Those first couple of movies I mentioned in the beginning of the show. Seeing the Fog for the first time, and obviously Halloween, which was the first Carpenter movie I saw. And then shortly after that, I saw The Thing, which just blew my head off, my body. But seeing those two movies as a young kid back in the days of VHS, and they were films that were shown on the late night, horror editions on cable. They were, just such a huge integral part of my youth as a kid. I mean, so, and seeing his footprint and what he's done as a director, and considering he was doing, especially his early work, creating these films with virtually no budget in comparison to, say, big Hollywood films. He was definitely a maverick in a lot of ways. He definitely worked outside of the system and opened the world for, obviously, American slasher films, but also independent filmmakers. And I definitely think that if John Carpenter, say, never existed, horror would be very different. I think it would have gone in probably a very different direction. I think we would have probably still had a degree of, the '80s slasher things being made, but I think they would have been different. I think the other parties that I mentioned, Lucio Fulci and Dario Argento and Herschel Gordon Lewis and Jess Franco, all those guys, they still would have went on to influence many, many directors. But I think it would have been different because I think it took an American director to kind of really put that genre on the map and say to the world that, well, these movies can actually make money too. They don't have to be just, it's not just reserved necessarily to these small cult audiences. There is, from a commercial standpoint, there's money to be made on a large scale. So, happy birthday to John Carpenter, 75 today, and I hope to see a sequel to Escape from New York. It would be interesting to see what that would be like. Seeing Kurt Russell as an older guy now, and it would be interesting. But what can I say? One of my all-time favorite directors, and and I think one of the most iconic and one of the most influential horror directors of all time. Happy birthday, John. Peace.